in rechten.
bir müşteri olan
Im rechten Teil an der Nordseite.
Moving forward.
So I'd like to address an issue related more specifically to technologies, what I'm inspired by GeoSimil calls the will to connection. Simil actually described the human interest and ability to make connections as a key feature of a species like the humans. In a famous quote, he talks about how the humans leave traces in the landscape. And also how they navigate according to these and follow along them. Now what I'm interested in is then some of the new technologies that afford the will to connection actually leaves no visible traces. We cannot see all the digital communication as we could trace the path through a field in the old days. Nevertheless, I think these are important technologies. Now what I want to speak to a little bit is the notion of digital technologies, network technologies, as part of a toolbox. I'm thinking here in particular on the practices related to urban design and planning, where most professionals would know that there is a number of various technologies that you can apply, including some of the latest GIS technologies, etc. Now what I wanted to argue here, and this is coming from a book chapter in the book called Termed Local and Mobile, edited by Adriana Silva and Mimi Scheller, I would like to argue that I think planning professionals need to add some extra tools. They need to think about an ICT toolbox and add some extra elements into that toolbox. I think it's clear that the contemporary city must be understood as complex assemblages of socio-technical networks, built environments and human subjects. And with the advent of network technologies, I think new perspectives arises, but also new issues, of course. Scholar Rob Kitchen has termed it the programmable city, or in collaboration with a colleague, he talks about code space. Now there's an interesting discussion about how these technologies are being immersed into material spaces, how they are affording our practices in material spaces, and how they increasingly challenge this notion of the digital versus the real. And how we carry these digital interfaces with us and how we actually connect with the material world through these interfaces. So if you think about the programmable city as a kind of a research agenda or set of questions, I think you could start asking, so what's happening in urban planning and urban design? And I would like to talk about that as from the point of view of an ICT toolbox. And I think an ICT toolbox for planners and designers could contain at least 3 dimensions. Now, hardly surprisingly, it could contain hardware, the technologies, the devices, the gizmos, the objects, the artifacts, the stuff that we use to measure, like for instance, GPS transmitters or those sorts of things. And of course, software, operative code, the apps that we download from our cell phones and those sorts of things. But then what I'm particularly interested in is also what I would like to call the manual, which is what I think of as a theoretically informed conceptualization of the city and its relationship to mobility and technologies. So I'd like to think of the potential in mobilities research to act as provider of parts of that manual. So we can qualify the discussion in planners' practices from taking it from either fear or mindless happiness about technology into a reflexive engagement by thinking about some of these concepts that we develop in mobilities research and how they can work as manuals for the toolbox tools, how they can enlighten people in terms of understanding what are these technologies actually affording and how are they connecting. So I think the need for an ICT toolbox or technology toolbox for planners will reach across a number of disciplines. City planners, architects, urban designers, various engineers could use these technologies in a very different way from what is being done right now. In Denmark, which would be my sort of reference point here, there is a beginning multidisciplinary and professional discussion about some of these technologies. However, I think it's in its infancy. And I think also a lot of municipal planners and urban designers and people working out of architectural companies are still relatively isolated and even not communicating a lot in these sorts of ways. Also, there is an issue about the way that municipalities organize the city planning into pillars or areas or departments like traffic, urban space in different departments, which of course doesn't make sense if you try to look at it from the point of view of the mobile subject who moves around in the city. Now, this is not a new situation, but I think the advent of location-based technologies and mobile communication devices actually challenges this idea of departmental sort of engagement with the city in that respect, and also thinking about the digital and the physical as separate realms, or the ITS is something that the traffic engineers must take care of and the public spaces are for the architects and so forth. And I think that is really being challenged by the way that these technologies seems to afford a more widely understood and on perspective of the city and how people are actually understanding the city. So I think the demarcation of visible, invisible, local, global, physical, digital becomes problematic. And I think we need the manual or the theoretically informed concepts to have a conversation about how to deal with these sorts of issues. Moreover, I think we could add that there is a generation gap or generation issue in the planning community. And I can speak mostly from my familiarity with the Scandinavian areas, but I know that there are actually quite some, a lot of people which has been practicing their city planning practice for, say, 30, 40 years and now reaching the age of retirement and not necessarily engaging and embracing with these technologies. And I think you can see this in a more general term in society, that young generations growing up with digital technologies have a completely different understanding, for better, for worse, of these technologies and their potential. But I think if we need to have, at least in Scandinavia, the next 5 years of planning not being sort of standing over in the corner, not wanting to play with the apps, we need to engage with them theoretically informed and also with a particular sort of level of theory. And I'd like to give an example of that. I was presenting some of our research to the local municipality some time ago, actually I would say a couple of years ago or 1 year and a half. And I was presenting some research, and after the meeting I went to the cantina with my colleagues and the people I was meeting, and I met other people sitting next to me. And there was a woman sitting next to me, a little older than me maybe, and she was politely sort of asking, so what are you doing? And I said, well, I'm here from the university presenting our latest research on GPS. And she spontaneously said, oh yeah, that's scary. And I think that speaks to a problem. I think not for her necessarily, but in general terms, how we understand and engage with these sorts of technologies. And mind you, this woman was actually a city planner, right? So she was, I think, supposed to maybe think slightly differently from of these sorts of things. Now, I'm not trying to suggest that there's a particular way of doing this, but I think we could actually contribute from the mobilities research to facilitate this discussion. Also, I think that there is a lot of awareness to the dark side issues around these technologies. I mean, the whole discussion about NSA and American surveillance and Big Brother perspectives has been around for a while. When we do research in Denmark, we have very strict regulations on how we can do any kind of tracking. So there is a sense of these sorts of things. At the same time, people happily take away their rights when they download the latest app or buy a new phone or whatever, right? So there's a lot of commercial surveillance, and there's a lot of public research, that don't have these sorts of technologies at hand. Now, I think that from the research we're doing in CEMUS, the Center for Mobilities and Urban Studies at Aalborg University, and in particular in the Mobility and Tracking Technologies research cluster, I think we can draw out a few ideas for why this is important for planners to engage with. I think there are 4 reasons why planners should have an ICT toolbox, including some of these more digital devices and those sorts of things. First of all, it's out there. As I speak, people log data by the numbers. People are organizing their trips, they're figuring out where to go to meet friends, where to shop, all these sorts of things, regardless if the planner thinks that's scary or not. So, if you wanted to go a little more sort of principle on this, you could say, if you claim to know and plan a city, you would also need to know and plan for these technologies. I think we reached a point where planners, city architects, designers have to realize that digital technologies, Wi-Fi, apps are as important as sewers, roads and buildings and streetlight. When you check into a hotel, you like there to be hot water in the tub, right? But you also would like free Wi-Fi. Increasingly, these sorts of services are being taken for granted as amenities or infrastructures facilitating some level of ordinary contemporary urban life. So I think the first reason is it's out there. It's part of the city. So if you're a city planner, you got to know that and be some kind of related to that. Now the second point about this is that the data produced is actually a huge asset for the planners. You could think of various ways of reporting. City governments and architectural companies can install their own sort of tracking technologies, but you can also think of how public and citizens are reporting back on a voluntary basis. We have a lot of examples worldwide about public facilities like reporting holes in the road or problems with infrastructure and stuff like that. And you can do that in a much more systematic way if you wanted to. So I think there is actually an opportunity to increase your level of knowledge by getting new types of data about the city, right? The third point I would argue is sort of facilitating this argument that planners need an ICT toolbox is related to the antidote to the Big Brother scenario. It is clear that these technologies offer lots of surveillance potential, some of them being state, some of them being commercial and what have you, that we can talk about in terms of power, surveillance and those sorts of things. But also, I think, and this is often not in the equation when planners talk, these tools are new participatory technologies. We've done a fair amount of research in our group exploring how these technologies can be used. And I know that there's a lot of talk about digital divide. So people who are not in command and control of digital technologies will not be able to participate. Now that is very true. However, from a research project we did very recently in a suburb of Aalborg where you have low-income groups, lots of immigrants and lots of young people, we engaged with the young people in that area, and I'm pretty sure that they wouldn't have come to citizen meetings and charrettes and listen to long talks by a planner somewhere in a school late at night, throwing charts after charts. But when we approached them and said, what about mapping the areas that you like and do not like, and then commenting on these GPS maps and so forth, we actually have those young people engaging in thinking about the future of their neighborhood and their city in a completely different way than you would have had otherwise. So I think there is actually a potential to think about some of these technologies as participatory tools as well. Now the fourth reason that I think these things are important is probably the most strange one from an ordinary planner's perspective. But if you look into the arts, you will see increasing number of artists exploring location-based technologies, GPS, and figuring out how this will bring us a new understanding of being, but also of places, right? And I think if you look to the art, and we actually done that in our research, we had some projects where we have put up cameras, but also lights and various loops between technologies and people in urban spaces as they move through. And some of them have been quite colorful and artful. I think you would actually see that some of these spaces are what I call performative urban spaces. They become spaces layered with technology where people can play with them. They can either change the light of a square or the light of a facade. They can exchange in making music or other types of artistic expressions by means of these technologies. Now, I know these are probably seen as marginal to city planning, but I think if you're a city planner and you're interested in how citizens engage with a city and how they play with the technologies in the city, you will actually also understand a potential of these technologies as well. So I'm not trying to suggest that this is all rosy and empowering, and there's lots of problems with these technologies. There are digital divides. Myself, I experienced prior to me having a smartphone, I was in a US city once at a conference, and I've been there before, so I thought, why don't I show around? And I said, I know a cool place, a nice public plaza with lots of ambience and life. And I took the group to that place and it was deserted, completely empty, nothing. It was highly embarrassing, and I was sort of looking, And then one colleague said, well, hang on a minute. And she took out her smartphone and says, let's go this way. And we went around the block, and there was a tiny red door. And we walked up some rather narrow stairs. And when we came up there, there was a beautiful, very ambient microbrewery. Now, I'm not suggesting that people should necessarily go to microbreweries in a particular way or particularly, but I think this was my moment of aha. This was when I realized that she was inhabiting a different city from myself, right? Because she could engage with a layer of information and data about the city and figuring out where to go that I actually was not accessing, right? I am doing that now because I have my smartphone and all is good. But what about all the other people who do not have their smartphones? So I think there is definitely scope for discussion about how these technologies might not even just have a digital divide, but even contribute to a reinforcement of digital divides. Now, having said so, I think most researchers will acknowledge that they're around, right? And we probably can't think them away, right? So I think we have to deal with them. And one of the ways of dealing with them is to have a conversation with our planning communities about understanding the importance and the potential of these technologies. So I think the ICT toolbox for planners needs to include some of these digital technologies, partly because they're out there, they're part of the city, partly because they offer new opportunities for getting better layers of data, more information, and ultimately, hopefully, better city planning, but also because they actually, if we use them right, in the right way, can increase the level of participation and contribute to democratic processes. Not saying that this is inevitable and it will happen by automatic. Of course it won't. There will be issues about how people are using them in less democratic forms, of course. And finally, I think the whole creative and artistic perspective is important to understand. And I think this is also a way we are engaging with city planners in this research group, is to try to understand that some of these spaces are much more than what they look like. They're actually playgrounds. And you might think this is not serious, but do you find any more serious activity than play? So these artistic practices and related to the digital technologies might sound as less serious, but I would like you to think about whether there's anything more important than play. If cities should not be playful, if we should not engage social interaction by means of utilizing play as a tool. Some of these might be digital, some of them be really low tech. A good square, a plaza with a nice placed bench, people will start playing, socializing and doing things. But I think we have to acknowledge that there are potentials for the ludic, for the playful, and those sorts of dimensions in this technology as well. So, coming to an end, the will to connection is as old as humans' movements across the surface of the earth. However, I think we need to understand that the traces are no longer only visible. Network technologies are creating new challenges, and urban planners and designers might benefit from expanding their toolbox with some of these technologies. However, I would recommend that we have a theoretically informed discussion about this, and this is what I call the manual for the toolbox, that the mobilities researchers engage with dialogues with city planners around the usefulness and the repercussions of these technologies to participatory practices, to the way cities are perceived, and to the quality of life within cities. So, as before, I would like to end my talk by thinking, what would the adequate policy implication be of having a conversation about more ICT toolboxes or more digitally aware planners? And I think that it's really important to have the manual discussion, to have the discussion from the point of view of mobilities research, to avoid a technological fetishism or a fear of technology that will be counterproductive to good city planning. And I think the manual or the work we're doing in mobilities research, testing out these technologies, the obligation from here is to take that to the planners and the policymakers and suggesting to them what are the potentials in these technologies, as well as, of course, as what are the pitfalls and downsides and dark sides to it. So, all in all, I think time has come for urban planners and designers to mobilize their will to connection.
Seite sowie den Außenbereich in Rechten.